The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. I lead for the Labor opposition on the Modern Slavery Bill 2018. With some reservations, Labor will be supporting the bill. We support a strong, active and modern framework that combats efforts to enslave and exploit vulnerable persons wherever and however that occurs. This bill, in our view, does not go nearly far enough in achieving those aims. However, it is a start, and we applaud the efforts of the bill's sponsor, the Honourable Paul Green, and the other members of the Parliamentary Working Party who have worked to produce what we have here in this chamber today. And of course they are my colleague, the Honourable Greg Donnelly, the Deputy President of this chamber, Trevor Khan, Mr Mason Cox, MLC, and Mr Robert Brown, MLC. And a number of those persons also participated under the chairmanship of the Honourable Paul Green on the human trafficking inquiry conducted by a committee of this House, which was also part of the underlying inspiration for this legislation. So what we have here today is a piece of legislation that starts the conversation on this vital topic and sets in train a process that begins to come to terms with the complex social and economic issues involved. So why a Modern Slavery Act? According to the International Labour Organization in 2012, there were 21 million persons around the world trapped in some form of forced labour, the term it uses to describe all forms of modern slavery, including trafficking, debt bondage and child labour. These are victims of exploitation in private sector activities such as manufacturing, construction, agriculture and also, of course, even in public sector supply chains. The UN said modern slavery and trafficking was, at that time in 2012, the second largest criminal industry in the world, with the ILO putting annual profits from forced labour at $150 billion. Mr President, according to the Global Slavery Index 2016, it was estimated that in that year there were 45.8 million persons worldwide who were victims of some form of slavery. Australia has an important role to play in fighting modern slavery. Two-thirds of people trapped in slavery worldwide are reported to be in the Asia-Pacific region, and it is estimated that an unbelievable 4,300 people are currently trapped in slavery right here in Australia. Australian government departments in the several jurisdictions are buying products that could be used made using slave labour, according to Anti-Slavery Australia, a law and public policy think tank that gave evidence to the human trafficking inquiry. It said there was considerable potential that government agencies in Australia are buying products and services with links to human trafficking or exploitation because ethical procurement guidelines are simply not up to scratch. In a submission to the New South Wales Parliamentary Inquiry on Human Trafficking, Anti-Slavery Australia said modern forms of slavery included exploited labour may be present in the supply chains of some departments because there was, and I quote, a complete absence of any real scrutiny, unquote, of supply chains, either at a Commonwealth or at a state level. In this state, potential government suppliers are asked whether they conform to relevant legislation, including the worst forms of child labour. Agencies are also required to ensure procurement is, quote, fair, ethical, transparent and incorporates probity, unquote. However, there is no enforcement mechanism and, as far as I can tell, no consequences for failing to follow them. The new Transparency in Supply Chains provisions in the UK's Modern Slavery Act aims to rout out the slavery lurking in many supply chains. And importantly, Mr President, it does so in relation to both public sector and non-government supply chains, something the legislation we are debating here today does not do. In the past few years in the UK, investigations into commodities tainted by slavery have included prawns from Thailand, debt bondage and forced labour in the global electronics industry, and claims of trafficking of migrant workers into the Scottish and Irish fishing industries. The new provisions in the UK make companies accountable for slavery and labour abuses occurring along their whole chain of operations. The idea is to ensure no slavery is linked to any British products or services, and to show consumers, investors and employees that companies are taking not a passive, after the fact, but a proactive stance. Any business or part of a business that has a global turnover of £36 million or more and supplies goods and services in the UK will have to produce and publish an anti-slavery and trafficking statement in a prominent place on its website every year. The statement must set out what steps the organisation has taken to ensure there is no slavery in any part of its business, including its supply chains. If a business fails to produce the statement, it could find itself at the sharp end of a High Court injunction, requiring the organisation to comply and potentially an unlimited fine. Foreign companies and subsidiaries that carry on a business in the UK will also have to comply with the new legislation. Any overseas subsidiary of a UK company that produces goods and services sold or used in the UK is also caught in its net. It's too soon to see what impact that legislation in the UK will have, but it certainly has cross-party support in that place, and we wish it well. California has also enacted a similar piece of legislation in 2010, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, on which the UK provisions were broadly modelled. In the last year, a series of lawsuits have been launched by residents of California claiming that businesses that have been since been linked to slave labour have deceived customers through inadequate public disclosures. The most visible of these cases is one launched by a resident against Costco, which alleges that Costco violated the California Act by stating it has a supplier code of conduct which prohibits human rights abuses in our supply chain, when evidence has emerged that farmed prawns sold by Costco were made with fish meal obtained from boats using slave labour. Several other class actions have been launched against Nestle, Mars and Hershey, demonstrating that consumers are increasingly willing to take corporate accountability into their own hands. Modern slavery legislation and other similar legislation are currently in place as well in France and in other parts of the European Union. It's well past time, Mr. President, that Australia joined this international movement. I acknowledge that interjection. At present, several voluntary international obligations relevant to modern slavery exist. Globally, more than 9,400 organisations from over 160 companies have committed as participants to the United Nations Global Compact, the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative actively engaging in responsible human rights and labour practices. The Global Compact Network, Australia, brings together those participants, other leading companies, non-profit organisations and universities to advance these same goals in our country. Between 2004 and 2016, the Australian Federal Police received almost 700 referrals relating to suspected human trafficking and slavery-related crimes, although 17 people only have been convicted so far. Most recently, in February 2017, 2 men pleaded guilty to charges of servitude relating to the treatment of Taiwanese workers in Brisbane. Recent media reports of exploitation of migrant workers in West Australian farms and market gardens, Victorian farms, and of course in 7-Eleven retail stores nationwide suggest this is a real but often hidden problem here in Australia. And in relation to 7-Eleven, of course, members will remember, Mr. President, that is an organisation that's covered itself in glory with the wage theft scandal. However, long-standing criminal laws against trafficking and slavery have not prevented their occurrence and for most part have not been relied upon by authorities to prosecute exploitation. And the effectiveness of pursuing employers for the exploitation of migrant workers through the Fair Work Ombudsman has also been limited. But by extending the responsibility to tackle exploitation to include businesses and not just government, it is hoped that the introduction of modern slavery legislation in this country will help tackle worker exploitation. And I note the Federal Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade tabled its final report on 7 December 2017, and its report, Hidden in Plain Sight, makes 49 recommendations to combat modern slavery here in Australia as well as around the world. The committee recommended the Australian Government introduce a Modern Slavery Act in Australia, similar to but improving on the UK modern slavery legislation. Among its recommendations were that labour hire contractors should be licensed to tackle the problem of coerced or debt-bonded workers living in slave-like conditions. These licensing schemes should include random audits and unannounced inspections of labour hire firms to ensure compliance. I note, and I acknowledge that interjection, but I note on this topic that New South Wales Labor Opposition has already outlined as part of its plan to combat the scourge of wages theft in this state a commitment to creating a system of licensing labour hire operations which will include detailed measures to ensure they provide safe, fair and reasonable work conditions to all workers, and included in the plan are related measures, new laws to hold head franchisors accountable for the actions of franchisees, making them liable for what takes place in their franchise network regarding workplace safety, wages and other working conditions. The report made other recommendations which I don't have time to deal with here, but even prior to that report, The federal Labor opposition had expressed strong support for the introduction of a new business reporting obligations and last year outlined a comprehensive modern slavery framework proposing to go further than the UK. The Turnbull government said in August of last year that it would introduce a Modern Slavery Act as soon as possible, but there's no sign of that occurring despite bipartisan support and strong support even in the business community. New South Wales Labor, the opposition here, has also outlined its comprehensive plans in this important area last year, and I will come to that in a moment. The bill before the House is said to address the findings and recommendations in the report of the Legislative Council Committee inquiry into human trafficking in New South Wales, which was completed last year. As I indicated earlier in my contribution, I commend that committee and its members under the chairmanship of the author of this bill, the Honourable Paul Green. I also suggest honourable members and the wider public should read that report, which is very good. In the chairman's foreword to the report, it states, and I quote, "Governments themselves also need to investigate their own supply chain and slave-proof them. The New South Wales government should introduce tougher requirements in its code of practice for procurement to ensure its departments and the other government bodies are ethically sourcing their supplies," unquote. Mr Deputy President, we on this side of the House are in complete agreement with this. However, the bill before the House at the moment does not do this. The major features of the bill is that a slavery commissioner is to be appointed. Unfortunately, the role does not include investigating individual cases. It does have a public awareness and advice functions, and the role will be to prepare a strategic plan to combat human trafficking and slavery-like practices in New South Wales. The Commissioner is to work with statutory agencies that will have a statutory duty to cooperate, which is good. The Commissioner will be an independent statutory body and will have to report annually to Parliament, and specifically it must report on government action concerning underage and forced marriages. Commercial organisations and organisations with a turnover threshold of $50 million operating in New South Wales must also publish an annual modern slavery statement which deals with supply chains. This, which is clause 22 of the bill, this is actually the only part of the bill with any real teeth, but sadly it excludes government agencies. So government departments, state-owned corporations, statutory authorities, often who are the purchasers as well as the suppliers of goods and services, are completely excluded from these reporting obligations, which I think is an unfortunate oversight of the bill. A public register will identify organisations in which goods and services may be products of a supply chain involving slavery, which is good. The bill also provides for modern slavery risk orders, which can prohibit people convicted of a modern slavery offence from taking certain action. Miscellaneous components of the bill amend the Crimes Act and are said to deal with cyber-sex trafficking and forced child marriage, all of which are worthy objectives. As I indicated earlier, the state opposition has itself last year adopted its own comprehensive modern anti-slavery policy, which was announced and received favourable coverage last year. The key features of the opposition's approach are slavery-proofing New South Wales government supply lines, which would be achieved through a tough and comprehensive state procurement policy and strengthening guidelines by specifically including anti-slavery provisions as compliance measures. The aim would be to ensure that no goods or services obtained by public money in this state are tainted by modern slavery. This must include making inquiries of tenderers as to ethical employment practices. New South Wales Labor already had policies which we took to the 2015 state election and which we retained, that commits a future state Labor government to only doing business with those companies and enterprises that have safe and fair work practices, and we are committed to eliminating unfair work practices at every stage of the public procurement supply chain, underpinned by the expenditure of public monies in this state. That was a pre-existing commitment which we maintain. Secondly, our vision was to establish a far more powerful New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner than the one created by this bill, able to collect and request data, inquire into the implementation of procurement guidelines, who would also not only be able to advocate and monitor and assess trends and developments as to the effectiveness of government policies, but would actually really drive compliance. And three, of course, conduct a public awareness campaign on human slavery in all its forms, and we note there are several campaigns that already focus on legal rights for victims of human slavery in Australia, usually from non-government organisations relating to forced marriage, but we think there is considerable scope to widen those. But just to return, we do support the bill as a good start, as a foundation, but it is worth noting that in the legislation, when you look at the functions of the Commissioner in Clause 9, or the Commissioner's public awareness and advice functions generally in Clause 12, or the duty, the reciprocal duty on the Commissioner and New South Wales agencies to work together, provided for in Clause 14, and the other obligations in Clause 15, together do not provide any real transparency over public sector procurement supply chains, which I think is an unfortunate oversight. As I said, the only real teeth in the legislation is to be found in Part 3, in Clause 22, which does deal with commercial organisations other than government ones, and businesses with a turnover of more than $50 million. Given that the New South Wales public sector, if you put it all together, is actually the largest purchaser of goods and services, not only in this country, but I think in the whole of the Southern Hemisphere, excluding what the state of New South Wales procures and pays for from the scope of this bill, I think is something that should be remedied in the near future, and something that we on this side of the House are committed to doing. I have read the bill very carefully. Well, I look forward to your contribution. This is definitely something that needs to be remedied, but even so, it doesn't go far enough, because there is actually no obligation on companies, as I read. Well, maybe not under this government, but and I do acknowledge that the author of the bill has tried to balance the different interests as between the government and the opposition to ensure the passage of the legislation. I understand that's not an easy thing to do. But even the obligations in Clause 22, which require these companies to report, there's actually no overriding obligation on them to eliminate exploitation and slavery from their supply chains. It is a reporting mechanism only about what activities they have undertaken that move generally in that direction, but there is no obligation on them to take the steps to achieve that objective, and that is something that we should return to. I want to finish on just dealing with three things said by the government in its contribution. The government says it reserves its right to move amendments in the other place, and the Parliamentary Secretary has outlined some of those concerns. Let me say, I think that's hugely disrespectful to both the author of the bill and this House. The government, of course, has the numbers in the other House, and it can do anything it wants, irrespective of anyone else's view. This is the House of Review. This is the House where there is a more diverse political representation, and if the government is committed to the passage of this legislation, is committed to parliamentary debate, it should be putting its amendments on the table so that we can see exactly what its concerns are, and that the government abides by the outcomes of the deliberations in this House. Because what the government is clearly signalling is it's going to gut the bill of any effective measures it has in the other place, and then try and stand this House up, basically on a take it or leave it basis. If that's where the government's coming from, they should be honest about it and not proceed in this current and I think disrespectful way. Secondly, and the government's identified this as a clear concern, this government, true to form about its hostility to openness and transparency, doesn't want an independent statutory officer in the Anti-Slavery Commissioner. It wants a public servant to fulfil that role, a public servant able to be subject to the direction of the executive. And that is a fundamental paradigm difference here. Government, because of its own involvement in the supply chains, may have a conflict of interest. There may be things in government procurement that do need to be identified and cleaned up, and that is why we need an independent statutory officer to fulfil this function. The third is the concerns expressed by the Parliamentary Secretary about small business. The legislation only hits bodies that have a turnover of over $50 million. That is a medium to large business enterprise on anyone's language, and it's not small business. So I think that is well, I think the government members are too smart to have made that mistake. I think this is a straw person designed to justify their gutting of this bill in another place. I hope I'm wrong. The passage of time will tell. I urge all honourable members to support the passage of this bill, albeit limited as it is.
Yeah.